Hello and welcome back to A Splash of Paint, where it's time for me to show you a few more simple tips to help you develop your painting and sketching techniques. I want to show you something I do quite a lot when I'm on holiday and things, and that is a bit of pen and ink sketching. I'm bringing a bit of painting as well. This is a sketchbook that I've recently done in Australia, and you can see the sketches. This is just using a black fibre tip pen, but what's interesting about this is that you can not only do it just for the black and white sketches, but also for doing the pen and wash techniques, which are really effective and very simple to paint because all the tonal work is actually set by the pen. This is a little fishing village, and you can see that the pen's gone in, and then just a very, very simple basic glaze of watercolour is all that is needed for this. The pen itself wants to be something that's waterproof or fade proof. A pen is very different to a pencil because you can't control the strength of a pen as such. So what you do is you work on a bit of a cross-hatching technique, and you almost scribble, making the lines wider to make the tone lighter, and of course you can go in the opposite direction as well to make it even darker. And this is the way that you do tonal work on a pen. It's very addictive work to do this. If I do a simple tree, you kind of scribble. You just do the sort of twirly effect of the tree, the foliage of the tree, and you just work it through, and you think about the shape. Imagine where the light and dark is if the light's coming down this way. We'll put all the darkness into that corner there, and I'll do a basic outline of the tree, obviously getting lighter as it comes over to this side, and then as we get towards the bottom we'll fill it and make it darker, darker, darker. Even put in layers as well, because trees have light and dark shades in them, so we'll bring those into it. So I'll put a bit of tonal work in there as well. And just gradually make these lines wider apart. Start to bring in some of the cross-hatching technique as well. You can get different widths of nib. This one's a 0.2, so it's quite a fine one. And that gives me lots of detail. And that's what I like to do in the sketches. The sketch is more memorable than a photograph because you've sat there for probably half an hour doing it, and it gives you more time to absorb the scene, and that's why I enjoy doing it. So I'm gradually making this lighter, even using little bits of flicks with the cross-hatching technique to make it look more like the canopy of a tree. Of course, I'll put the trunk in as well, down the centre. This can be quite dark. Then we'll work it into the tree. Put in a few branches, poking through, put in a few random dots and spots. There we go. So it's worth putting a little bit of time into that. If I put a little bit of landscape at the bottom, and then just maybe just a very basic impression of a distant building, I'm putting very little pressure on with the pen. Just get a little barn or something just coming in the background there. Again, I'll put the shadow side on, which I can do on a diagonal line. It doesn't have to be precise, it's a sketch after all. And then just add a little bit of shading underneath the barn there, and put a little bit of a chimney or something on. And just to show you how you can apply watercolour paint over the top of this, very simple thing to do. Just using a size 6 brush. The pen dries in seconds, it's waterproof. The paper I'm working on, by the way, is still watercolour paper, but you can use a cartridge paper for this. But if you're doing the paint over the top, it's better to use a watercolour paper. So if I mix a very simple green, lemon yellow, natural blue will do for that. Plenty of water. And just give it a very quick glaze, and you can see how quick it goes on. And all the tonal work is actually set by the actual pen. And it's nice just to put a few little bits and spots around and make it look as though it is got a bit more detail. But the basic idea is a very simple idea. A little bit of burnt sienna there, very, very weak and watery, just to put the roof of the building on there. And just a bit of grey or something, a bit of natural grey, just to put in the building itself. It just shows how simple and effective it can be to do some sketching, pen and ink sketching while on holiday. And of course you can even come back once the paint is dry and add more detail if required. So there you go, folks. So there you have it, folks, a nice little exercise for you to try. Why not show us how you get on by simply uploading examples of your work on the community section of the SAA website. Visit saa.co.uk for details. Right, folks, time for us to cross over to the other side of the studio and join popular mixed media artist Alison Board as she lifts the lid on Gesso Primer and demonstrates how it's perfect for adding a touch of texture to your own wonderful works of art.
Hello everyone. Today I would like to show you why you shouldn't be without Daler-Rowney Gesso Primer. I use it because I am predominantly a mixed media artist and I like to combine watercolour painting with lots of other techniques, and Gesso is one of my most favourite products to be able to do this with. Now, Gesso is actually a primer for acrylic painting and oil painting, and you use it normally to prepare a canvas, but I use it for textures on watercolour paper, and I'll show you 3 different applications of how you can apply it to your watercolour paper, and then I'll show you what the results are when you wash watercolour over the top of it. So Gesso comes in a pot like this, quite gloopy in consistency, quite thick, which you can use to your advantage, and I use a painting knife with it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scoop up a little bit of Gesso onto the back of my painting knife, and I tend to take off the excess on the front so that you've got a nice coating of Gesso on the back and the front is pretty clean. And I use the back edge of the palette knife to pull across the paper so it hits and misses. Now it can be a little bit tricky to see unless you're in really good light, but the great part about it is if you just try and care a little bit less about your application and you use quite a light touch, you get a lovely random finish to it. So I'll just do a little bit more of that further down the page. And when you've got a really nice quality watercolour paper, because it's a rough texture, it hits and misses even more. So that's one way that I like to use it. Another way, which is the same again, coating the back of the blade, taking off the excess on the front, is to use it in a sticky fashion. So you put the palette knife onto the surface and you pull it off. And this is great for recreating mosses and rocks and all the sorts of things that require lots of texture. So we'll just have a little bit more of that. And you can hear it and you can feel it onto the surface. And it creates a little dappled effect where the paint will sink into the pits and troughs and stay there. Another great way of using it is to use the painting knife on the edge. So I dunk it into the Gesso, I take off the excess front and back, and then I run that blade back through the Gesso again so the very edge is coated. And then you can use the edge of your knife to pull it down across the page so that you can get long, thin, random lines. You won't get a very consistent line, but you will get it where it hits and misses. You can also do this technique with a cut-up credit card, which is a rather nice way of using it and is great for doing grasses and for anything that requires texture in your foreground. So those are my 3 main ways of applying it to the watercolour paper. And here on this side, I've got some already dry, and I'm going to pop some paint over the top of it so you can see what happens when the paint comes through. The great thing about Gesso is that it not only absorbs some of the colour, but it repels an awful lot of it as well. So you will find that when the paint goes over the top of it, it will tint the Gesso ever so slightly to a paler version of your wash, but it will also repel it and push it away, and you'll see what I mean. So let's mix up some cerulean, which is a lovely colour because it granulates when it hits the paper anyway. And to that, I'm going to add a little bit of lamp black for some drama. There we go, mixing it all up, making sure that it's thoroughly mixed. And then you'll see straight away where I drag this over the paper, thin it out with a little bit of water to pull that colour down. You can see where the Gesso is occurring. So you get this fabulously random version across the surface. So here we go, it's repelling it, but it's also taking some of the colour on. And I've used this technique for clouds, I've used it for rocks, I've used it for the sides of buildings, I've used it for all sorts of foliage in trees, grasses, all manner of things. And it's just another way of getting texture onto your paper, but mixing your media at the same time.
Thanks, Alison. A really easy technique to try. Why not experiment and discover how gesso can add interest and texture to your next artistic project? Well, folks, time for a little break now, but join us in part 3 when watercolour wonder Geoff Kersey returns to complete his tranquil boat scene in part 2 of today's Try Your Hand At project. We'll see you after the break.